Gandhi, could not be with us today, so we're going to go ahead and do that.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Evan Gandhi, and I'm an associate professor of Asian American Studies at UCLA. Today, I'll be talking about my Greetings, everyone. My name is Evan Gandhi, and I'm an associate professor of Asian American Studies at UCLA. Today, I'll be talking about my my great-uncle, Daita, or Colonel Ngọc. Many thanks to Zora for organizing this panel and to Andrew for joining the conversation. I sincerely apologize for not being able to attend in person, but I hope my comments today can provide generative points of connection with my panelists. If you'd like to reach me directly, please don't hesitate to email me at elegandhi@ucla.edu. So I'd like to start with a question. What does it mean to remember someone whom you've never met? For the post-war generation, what are, to quote scholar Yvonne, quote, alternative ways of knowing, sensing, and imagining the refugee afterlives of war, unquote. Because my Hai died in Vietnam, he never got to be a refugee. Or rather, he refused the trajectory of escape and refuge, choosing instead to give his life for an anti-communist, democratic Vietnam. Born in the refugee diaspora after the end of the war, I never got to meet my Hai in person. And yet he shaped my family's memories and silences, our kitchen table conversation, and our relatives' opportunities and choices. And the contours of my research as a second-generation Asian American committed to carrying the histories of my ancestors forward. So for the first 21 years of my life, the memory of my Hai was wrapped in what Yvonne calls, quote, refugee aphasia, a, quote, perforated language full of silences, pauses, and hesitation. She decided to leave Vietnam in April 1975. She wouldn't hear of his death by public execution in August 1975 for refusing to surrender at the end of the war until many months after the fact. To my mother, Dr. Elaine Singleton, who was a beloved uncle and godfather, from whom she was separated too soon. Around the time that I was first learning about his story in college, she was also researching his afterlife in the diaspora, the way he was venerated on street signs and online memorials by his South Vietnamese comrades in arms. Yet, even in his death, or perhaps because of it, he facilitated intergenerational dialogue. As a ghost, he impressed upon how I came to know about Vietnam, about the war. When I was a junior in college, I created a film based on extended oral histories of my Hai, a woman who helped raise me, but whom I realized I knew nothing about her life in Vietnam, before and during the war. In one interview, she mentioned her oldest brother in passing, that he had served in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, that he was famous, and that I could find videos of him online. So curious, I typed his name into Google, and I was struck by how many results, both in Vietnamese and English, appeared. I clicked on a YouTube video and found myself face to face with this ghost, a fellow graded hero whom I had never heard about until that moment. So this encounter led to another project I'm going to share with you today. Wanting to know more about my Hai, I interviewed his siblings and their memories of him, not only as a military martyr, but also as a younger brother. This project resulted in an undergraduate history thesis, later an academic article, and then this short film, Who Was Colonel Ngọc, that I'd like to share with you today.
So he wasn't just a colonel, he was a real hero.
Em khoảng 7 tuổi rồi đó, là em có lên ở Dương Hai.
He
Ở Dương Hai thì lúc đó là ở đi học 12 tuổi với em ở trên. Sau khi về đó thì hội quản
War displaces people. Refugees flee from their homelands to escape death and violence. But war displaces memory as well. War is a gaping wound in the psyche's conceptualization of the past. Some seek to heal this wound, to fill this hole. Others leave the wound alone. They bury it in silence and hope it fades away. This is a ghost story, a story about Colonel Homoka, about a man publicly executed. At the center is absence. This is a story of what surrounds the absence, of how I found Colonel Homoka, of how he started as a displaced family member wrapped in silence, of how I stumbled upon online videos and blogs venerating him in a moment of excess, of how I then pieced together the fragmented narratives to reconstruct a multifaceted portrait, a portrait that reflects the struggles for control over the past.
Thì đó nó nghĩ là anh là người rồi, nhưng mà tôi đứng trên một lập trường giữa tự do và cả ví dụ đi, thì người nào nó sống cho cái bổn phận, cái quê hương người đó, cái tư tưởng cái của cái người đó. Bởi vì người ta nói là xưa tại sao là con thần, con ca biết cách biết chuyện con thần không? Có nghĩa là giữa hai bên thắng với nhau, mình là chung thì đó là con thần. Thì cậu hai là thắng, mình nghĩ là nếu mà cậu hai chết vậy thì cậu hai cũng được trung thành là thắng, và cậu hai nó làm tròn cái bổn phận thì tất nhiên đối với một cái đất nước của mà cậu hai là con thần.
Đúng là theo cái ý nghĩ của mình và ý nghĩ của anh hai thì đúng là tại vì anh hai về vì hay nói là bên đây và bên kia, và bây giờ anh hai là bên miền Nam thì anh hai phải bảo vệ cái miền Nam, anh hai không có tự nhiên có là hai một chiếc mà hai bên đều đánh nhau để mà muốn không chiếc hết, thì bên nào thì cũng muốn bảo vệ cái đó, để cho nên là anh hai không có chịu buộc tội, không có nghĩa là muốn bảo vệ thì anh hai thà chết chứ không có chịu.
Dường như là đối với gia đình á, đối với gia đình thì Ngọc Cẩn là mình không có yếu, thương cha mẹ, thương dì, rất là thương dì và còn nhớ ơn ông bà nữa. Thì khi mà cậu đi về Sa Đéc là lúc mới bắt đầu nhận chức thì cậu cũng có đã dành dụm được một ít tiền là lo mồ mả cho ông bà ngoại. Bây giờ hiện tại là cậu á, cái mồ mả đó rất là chắc chắn, và để tới bây giờ mặc dù con cháu đã đi xa, không còn ai ở với đợt giá nữa, nhưng mà mồ mả của ông bà vẫn còn nguyên vẹn, là nhờ công đức của cậu Cẩn đã xây dựng. Chứ lúc đó chúng tôi cũng nghèo và ở xa, cho nên là cũng không, con cháu cũng không có ai làm được.
Nghĩa là nói chung là anh hai thì dân thì rất là thương, nhưng mà giờ sống theo cái chế độ vàng, cái chế độ kia họ vô thì đương nhiên mà mình phải như vậy thôi, cái chất phải như vậy thôi. Nhưng mà anh hai thì rất là anh hùng, nghĩa là khi chết, khi mà lúc mà mẹ nói là vẫn họ trong tù là họ nói nó không cho ăn, nhưng mà anh hai cũng không nói là kêu là mình phải đầu hàng, mà nhất định là không đầu hàng, nghĩa là nó bảo mình cái giống như mình kêu gọi là mình đầu hàng để cho sử dụng mình vậy đó. Nó là cực khổ lắm ở tù, mà nghe những cái người bỏ ở tù chung á, sau này họ kể lại bắt anh hai làm đủ thứ hết á, là đổ cà bô rồi cái gì đó được cho nhịn đói rồi kia nọ, mà nó bắt là phải nghĩa là phải mở miệng ra nói cái tiếng đầu hàng, nhưng mà anh hai nhất định là không nói. Thì khi mà sau đó ra sự thánh á, thì lúc đó anh hai ốm vậy đó. Thì khi sự thánh á, thì vẫn nói một cái tiếng nói là Cộng hòa cũng đó.
Lúc mà anh hai viết học tập thì khi anh hai viết một cái thư gửi về cho gia đình rất là cảm động. Nghĩa là lúc đó là chị em ai cũng biết là cái tình cảm anh hai đối với gia đình quá, tức là không có diễn tả ra, nhưng mà khi mình đọc cái lá thư đó là mình không thể kể được những cũng như nước mắt của mình vậy đó. Nên từ đó rồi cho tới khi ngày hai mất á, mỗi lần nghĩ đến này là không, cứ nghĩ đến cái sự quan tâm lo lắng của anh hai rồi khi mà mình nhận được cái thư đó mình mới thấy cái tình cảm quá nhiều. Thì đó là cái mình không biết cái đó là kỷ niệm hay là cái gì, nhưng mà cái đó không có nhiều quá.
Không riêng bà Tám mà cả gia đình cũng vậy, ai cũng tôn trọng ông hai, là vì hai là cái người lớn nhất trong gia đình. Những thứ hai nữa là cậu hai là khuôn khổ là nhất vì mà cái tình thương dành cho gia đình trọn vẹn, mà cái tình đối với quân đội, những người thấp hơn cậu hai thì cậu hai cũng làm tròn công phần đó. Chính vì vậy mà bà Tám nó nên nói là như thế nào. Bà Tám chỉ nói rằng có rất nhiều người, rất nhiều họ đã lên internet để nói về cậu hai, thì đương nhiên đối với cậu Tám thì tất cả những cái gì đó cũng còn chưa bằng cậu Tám nữa. Cậu Tám vẫn nhớ là ngay gì hơn họ.
Tại vì bên Việt Nam thì nhà của người chị thứ ba có thờ anh hai. Tức là anh hai thì người chị thứ ba làm dỗ thì em cũng tụ lại để mà sum họp đó, rồi mới kể những cái kỷ niệm về anh hai. Người nào có cái gì mà để mà nói về anh hai thì người đó sẽ nói ra kỷ niệm. Đây là chị ba người mà để anh hai đó, mỗi năm đều làm đến chỗ cho anh hai. Thì khi đó thì chị ba nói là kêu các em về để mà nhớ cái ngày đó, rồi chị em mới làm sum họp lại thì nhắc đến những cái chuyện kỷ niệm về anh hai hồi nhỏ rồi lớn như thế nào rồi kia nọ vậy đó. Thì có nghĩa là cứ hãy năm hoặc là đều có nhớ đây, gọi là nhiều khi gặp nhau không rồi Tết với người kia nọ vậy thì cũng hay nhắc về anh hai.
When Evan decided to do that in the something about him, and I'd be happy to involve on that with Actual Vietnamese people live in the United States here, they already know a lot about my brother because every year they do memory day for him. And they they do it the TV, Vietnamese TV, and things, the view, and that bunch of stuff. Everything, I feel like most of you already know, but I just want to keep on my family side. It's just all I thought.
This is our story, our family's story. A story of a brother, a cousin, a granduncle, a man we loved and continue to love, a man we remember, a public hero and traitor. We do not share his glory, we do not share his fame. Who has a claim to the writing of history? We voice our memories. He is archived in our hearts.
helped conduct the interviews and who in the process learned more about her brother's last days, but she had been shrouded in silence after she had left Vietnam. So in this way, Hai is still facilitating intergenerational dialogues between me and my line, between the living left behind, a refugee survivor, and her granddaughter. Hai also shapes my research interests on South Vietnam as an Asian American Studies professor. In undergrad, when I was first learning about Hai, I also became more interested in Asian American as a political identity, and in Asian American Studies as a field of political critique. Initially, I struggled with how to reconcile the field's origins in the Asian American movement's leftist politics and anti-Vietnam War protests, with the anti-communist fervor of the South Vietnamese American community, both those in Vietnam, like my own Hai, and those who left as refugees. Ostensibly, Asian American activists and South Vietnamese subjects hold opposing positions, differing visions of a post-colonial Vietnam, different relationships to U.S. empire. I was attracted to Asian American Studies Project of Liberation, but I did not want to betray the memory of my Hai, the dream that he died defending. Critical refugee studies scholars such as my mother offer a way forward, a commitment to sitting with and working through complexity and contradiction, of taking seriously the agency of South Vietnam, while also criticizing the overreach of U.S. imperialism. Hai has taught me to attend to the South Vietnamese vision of post-colonial independence, which has been suppressed by both the United States and communist unified Vietnam, even as I critique the way that nationalist projects are predicated on inevitable exclusions. Intergenerational inheritance is not about passive reception. Instead, it's about revival and remixing, a way of putting ghost stories in conversation with new generations' questions. It's about creating a, quote, meditative, reflective space of beauty, creativity, and regeneration. That's again from the actor. So even now, I am listening, open to where my own Hai will take me next. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we're going to now transition back to the presentation. And I'm going to introduce yourself, Anne.
Yeah. Hello everybody. I am Anton, and I'm here to talk about my father, the General Zhang Guangqi. It's an interesting thing because if you Wikipedia my father, my name will show up as his son, and if you Wikipedia, his name will show up as my father. I am not a researcher. I don't write about the Vietnam War. The bulk of my writing is about post-war literature, the effect of war on refugees, the diaspora, the experience of Vietnamese in America. What I am going to do today is actually, because being a journalist, I managed to interview my father quite a few times, including for documentaries. And so the piece I'm going to read is actually as told to, as a form of writing that I spent about 3 months in 2013 talking to my father. And this is basically in his own idea and voice that I'm going to read for you. But first, the background of my father. Born in the Mekong Delta in 1932 to a wealthy landowning family, Thi Quang Nam spent 25 years in the Army and rose to the rank of Lieutenant General in the Republic of Vietnam by the time the Vietnam War ended. He joined the Vietnamese National Army in 1950 and graduated from the National Military Academy in Dalat. He held the position of Commander of the RVNAF Artillery Training Center, Commander of the Artillery in I Corps, Deputy Commander, Commander of the 9th Infantry Division, and Commander of the Vietnamese National Military Academy, and so on. And he left Vietnam on April 30th, 1975 on a naval ship when the last president of South Vietnam surrendered to the North Vietnamese Army. During his military service, he was awarded many medals, including the Vietnamese National Order, the U.S. Legion of Merit, and the Korean Order of Chung Mu. My father was also a martial art expert. He He also held a third-degree black belt in Taekwondo, where he had to go to Korea to gain that degree. He got his baccalaureate in French philosophy and later in the U.S. At age 45, a bachelor degree in history, and then at age 48, an MBA, and then he worked as an executive for the Bank of America for 2 decades. He then, in retirement, wrote 2 books, The 25-Year Century and How It Ends Up, while working as a substitute high school teacher for many years. I should add here that my father taught himself English while fighting the war in Vietnam. And the reason being because he had so many American advisors and he didn't want just to speak French. So he taught himself English, which is quite amazing. Unfortunately, he died of COVID complication in January 2021 of the age 83 months. All right. The piece is called Setting the Record Straight on South Vietnam, as told to Andrew. For Victor Hugo, the famous poet and writer, who was a great admirer of Napoleon, the 19th century had only 2 years. Ce siècle avait 2 ans. In those 2 years, peace was established in Europe and France reigned supreme. If I could borrow from the great French poet, I would say that for the great number of young men of my generation, the 20th century had only 25 years. Why? From 1950 to 1975, which covered my entire military career, I participated in the birth of the Vietnamese National Army. I grew up and participated with this army that achieved some of the greatest feats in contemporary history. During the Viet Cong Tet Offensive in 1968 and during the North Vietnam Multi-Division Great Offensive in 1972. My career and the careers of my comrades in arms abruptly ended in 1975 with the Army's tragic demise. In 1966, when I was 33, I was one of the youngest in the Army to become a general. At 39, I became a lieutenant general and was promoted to commander of an Army Corps task force along the demilitarized zone, the DMZ. I was 43 when the war ended. I left Vietnam when Saigon fell and joined my family who fled a few days before me. Got an MBA and became a trust officer and raised my family in the suburb of north of San Jose. Later on, I retired and taught local high school in the San Jose area. I taught French, English, math, and PE. I also hold a 3rd-degree black belt. Yeah, he used to talk about that all the time. I still practice at 76. This is when we was interviewed. Almost every day, and I go regularly to the gym and play tennis on the weekend. And in the summertime, I swim. After retirement, I was reluctant to write a book about myself. I agree with the French proverb that says, "Le moi est haïssable," the me is detestable. But I changed my mind. The literature in the U.S. regarding the Vietnam War is one-sided. Books written by American soldiers, journalists, historians, and public officials only view the war from the American perspectives, while the perspectives of South Vietnamese Army, their former ally, was often ignored, or worse, portrayed as cowardly and weak, despite the fact that more than 300,000 South Vietnamese soldiers died during the course of the war, as compared to 58,000 American soldiers. Our toll and suffering was far greater than what Americans care to imagine or know. Many American journalists were anti-war. The war was presented from the most unfavorable angles, with the media sensationalizing the news and distorting the truth, if necessary, to achieve its anti-war objective. It is no secret that, for one reason or another, the U.S. media was biased and, if not outright, hostile to the Vietnam War. They carried that attitude toward looking at the history of the Vietnam War as well. Even the Vietnamese communists had written quite a few books, which were eagerly translated into English by many American professors to brag about their military and political achievements after the war. North Vietnam General Van Binh Du's Great Spring Victory, for instance, is widely circulated. Thương Như Tâm, a former cabinet minister in the Viet Cong Provisional Revolutionary Government, wrote Memoir of the Viet Cong to tell the story of his life and frustration with the heavy tactics of Hanoi. There's an American fascination with the only enemies who defeated them. Even former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara went to Vietnam years later to talk and interview his counterparts. The South Vietnamese who fought along the U.S. Army, McNamara never bothered to talk to, and many lived near him in the U.S. Only a handful of books had been written in English by journalists, public officials, and soldiers from the former Republic of Vietnam. Despite the fact that the largest Vietnamese population outside of Vietnam is here in the U.S., I believe that it was time to set the record straight. That was when I wrote my memoir. These two books are here. By the way, the books he published were published in Texas, University of North Texas Press. The 25-year century, a South Vietnamese general remembers the Indochina War was published in 2000. It was my take on what happened and how Saigon fell. 2 years ago, I finished with another. It's called Hell in Anglo. It's a less-known battle in 1972 when the Communist Army attacked from the east, from Cambodia, via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Anglo, a small town, was defended by 6,900 South Vietnamese soldiers who fought against 30,000 North Vietnamese and 100 tanks. Against heavy odds, they withstood 94 days of horror and prevailed at a tremendous cost. My memoir I dedicated to my grandchildren, Amy, Eric, and Brandon, all born here in the U.S., innocent and with no memories of Vietnam. I wish to leave something lasting and a record of what happened, so when they are old enough, I hope they will read and learn something of their heritage. The book on Anglo is primarily to tell the South Vietnamese side of what happened, and more importantly, to render justice to their history. These unsung heroes have inspired me throughout writing this book and were the source of constant encouragement for me to carry out this at times very difficult undertaking. I bear the loss of my homeland. So many of my comrades in Nam died, some committed suicide, and many were sent to concentration camps. I feel both anger and sadness. Anger because we were a democracy abandoned by our allies, the U.S., at the darkest hour of our history. But I tell myself that the Indochina and the Vietnam War bought time for the free world to regroup, to marshal its energy, and to finally win the Cold War. If this were not true, then let my work be testimonies to the extent of the devastation and the human tragedy caused by unnecessary wars, and that my friends and comrades in arms died for nothing. I get philosophical in old age. I understand that tragedy can strike the best and the brightest, and human sufferings have their intrinsic grandeur. I don't expect history to be kind. I am in exile. America is destination, but it never be fully home. But I do my best to contribute to the canon of Vietnam War literature and balance the perspectives of that three-sided war, one in which the South Vietnamese point of view is woefully underrepresented. Besides, I am optimistic. Since the Marxist system is all but collapsed, I still nourish the dream that I will live long enough to have the opportunity to come back to a free and democratic Vietnam. That was written in 2013. My father never got to see his Vietnam. Though he talked about it near the end of his life, still longing and still wanting to see a free, democratic Vietnam. And I should add that when he finished Hell in Anglo, which took him a long time, he spent a lot of time researching, he spent a lot of time interviewing people, he wanted the book to be impeccable as an argument. And when it was accepted by the university press, my mother told me that he sat down and wept. And mind you, my father was a general and he never weeps. So the reason he wept, I suspect in retrospect, is that all those years watching him, disciplined military ramrod back straight in the morning after dinner, writing his book, researching his book, often by writing by handwriting, a habit from old age, is that the ghosts of those who died were with him so bad that they wanted him to finish the story. And in my imagination, they stood in silence, watching my father. There is something powerful when you look at something and tell a story. So that when he finished, it makes sense that because he achieved something that really is Herculean for a man who fought in the Vietnam War, who then raised his family in his 40s as an American executive for a bank, in a completely different life, and yet carried the weight of that mission. He carried that weight so much that it eats into all the family life in America. So I'm going to read from my first book because though this story ended and mine began, and though I am not an expert on the Vietnam War, I was an Army grad. I saw much of the war as a child from the point of view of the helicopter. But I also got to America quite early when I was 32, but 11. Yeah, I was 11. So then my life changed so drastically. So this is just to capture what it's like when we first came to America and my father continued to be obsessed with Vietnam and my life changed. Even now, I found it almost impossible to talk about the tragedy in the life of those who emerged from the war, seemingly unscathed. Among those who suffer far worse amidst a community formed by calamity and unspeakable losses, my family is considered very lucky. People have lost loved ones in the war, to the re-education camp, to the new economic zones, and to the Thai pirates, to thirst and starvation over an high sea. We came early among the first wave. We survived as a unit intact. Many came later after years of languishing in the refugee camp. So we internalized our losses instead, my family and I, and grieved alone. An otherwise seemingly smooth trajectory toward a middle-class life in America was marred by familial discontent. The old values no longer held. Bickering became our habit. Arguments erupted daily. But I, the youngest, fell silent. And my silence, I think, hurt my parents more than my brother and sister did. At least they were interacting. They fought, but they stayed around. Engaged. They both went to college while living at home. I, on the other hand, was at the earliest age plotting my escape. I had grown to resent my entire family, but especially my own father. His memories, his stories were powerful, repeated, they became lore, and they had begun to exert their terrible powers over him. Worse, they were beginning to snare him as well. For despite his French education and his willingness to work hard, he had no idea what my life was like outside of the house. His only way to measure anyone or anything was in relation to the war, to the past, to his position as a respected general and warrior. And this was how he held himself in America, which is to say, overtly proud, contemptuous of the world, and unless he was drinking, cold and aloof. Yet the past was dividing us, and father did not see it. He saw himself as a political exile and had no need to question his identity whatsoever. As his children, it was understood that we were to accept that exile identification for ourselves as well. This interaction with Americans were all out of necessity. He claimed none of them as his friends. But in his general living in exile in America, at least he knew where he stood in relation to history. His identity, even if ignoring it, was assured. In war, after all, there are winners and there are losers. As a Vietnamese community began to form around him, and his culture of nostalgia defined the communal ethos, father was becoming once more a visible icon of an unfinished war. Its extraterritorial territorial passion gave rise to a new sensibility in the little silos, sprouting up and down the California landscape and across the United States, and was one that dwelt on tragedy and grief. To be a fully active part of this community, members more protest and on occasion gather on mass to demand a communist free homeland. If this society father was a VIP, a guest at political rallies, and engaging speaker during tent festivals, a symbol of lost heroism. I once saw him on the dais on the fairground in Santa Clara speaking with passion, his audience in rapt attention. He was spurring the collective to continue on with the good fight against their mortal enemy, the communist regime, even if only in thoughts and words. But what about his teenage son? I was growing up with two very different ideas of history, two sets of civilizations, two traditions, two languages, two sets of behaviors, and I was, for what seemed now a long, long time, floundering between them. There was Vietnam, its cast of exiles whose sorrow and losses held them in many ways beholden to the past. Theirs is a history that runs seemingly backward. Their life in America had no special meaning, no great implications. They only remember what was robbed from them, what was lost. History for father and for the men who still wear the army uniforms at anti-communist rally decades after the war ended has a tendency to run backward to memories of the war, to a bitter and bloody struggle whose end spelled their defeat in exile. And it holds them static to a lonely nationalism stance. They live in America, but their souls are in Vietnam. The history of the defeated is private and circular. It binds them all at the core. It is the ball and chain around the prisoner's bleeding ankle. In it, the only moral direction to be had is the one that demands complete loyalty to the past, not to own it, mind you, but to let oneself be fooled by it. And to do so, one has to accept forever the status of a stranger in a strange land. I wrote that in 2010, but the irony of life is that I ended up spending so much time in Vietnam in 2018 and teach in Vietnam and work in Vietnam in some ways that I got caught there during COVID and couldn't come home when my father was dying. And so I'm going to end with this email to basically say what goes around comes around. And this email I sent to my best friend when my father passed. My father loomed large in my life, and this death at 88 and a half nevertheless left me more devastated than I ever expected. I take it as a strange blessing that at age 57 that I have never experienced profound grief until now. And it shocked me to my core because I find it to be absolutely true. The loss of a country, a broken heart, loved one gone in the blink of an eye, my lovely, optimistic, do-gooder niece, for instance, just a few months ago, of my mother's long drawn out Alzheimer's, because say goodbye to her took 8 years, and it will take more. Yet my poverty mind left such an absence and unspeakable void that I find reality itself a little suspect. How can it possibly exist without my father? In retrospect, maybe I am more sad for myself than his actual death. He who lived an epic life, who wrote books, who traveled the world, who loved the same woman for 65 years, and recited French poetry, especially when drunk, whose last words were, "Who would take care of your mother?" Sad because I don't get to be the child anymore. The enfant terrible is so proud to be rebellious against his dad's ideas, so proud that he was able to walk out from under his father's large shadow to leave himself and walk his own path. This last night, my sister was mercifully allowed entry, wearing a formal suit, and FaceTime me just in time. She tried a dozen times before I managed to pick up the phone. Me who stuck in Vietnam with no ways of getting home louder she yelled, it's hard of hearing. I think the whole floor of my condo complex must have heard me when I left. Other heavy medications, and with eyes closed. He struggled to calm. I found this gesture to be such a blessing of finality. Wow, I didn't expect that long struggle to speaking. How difficult it was to fight men who tolerate no weakness, no weakness in anything. Well, I am now grateful to all those flowers. Those lashes, all the little outcome pressure. And I like this overlooking the river of Sidon, looking at the very spot where Dad took the ship out to sea on April 30th, 1935, and never to return. I find it odd too that I am here because it is convenient and safe. Dad longed to return to his beloved homeland and never could. Vietnam was his destiny. While Vietnam is, and I suspect will always be, one of my many destinations. It was homeland, sure, but it would never be home wholeheartedly again. Which is to say, I envy my father's unwavering patriotism, which I don't have. But life is full of irony. COVID took my father away, but it did something else also. I said this in interviews before, but I find it to be more true now. I am still not sure about my love for Vietnam, but I am now committed to helping it in my own capacity. As a teacher, as a writer, but whatever else. Because I love my father. So, thank you.
My question is, with your public, like the first note and first book, film, is anyone approaching for translating to Vietnamese or the audience in Vietnam or will it be self-serve?
Yeah, so the translation problem in Vietnam has been told. There is a great interest of Vietnamese American writing in American literature and Vietnamese American society in general. I give a lecture on Vietnamese diaspora in America to an audience in Vietnam, and scholars there came up to tell me that they don't have any statistics, they don't have any study, but they would love to know more. It's just an incredible gap. The same thing with not just my books, but a lot of Vietnamese American books. Vietnamese for sure, you know, Ocean Blue and so on. But translators can translate, but they have to go through sort of this, you know, censorship, and the censorship tend to be no and not yes. So very few pieces actually get published in Vietnam because of that. While there is a hunger for Vietnamese to read Vietnamese American literature, there is still this barrier that is really hard to cross. Like Vietnamese Sympathizer is not published, even though
follow up with that.
Yeah.
I think the sympathizer was not published in Vietnamese, but the refugees, the other book by Viet, they took out the whole chapter in Vietnamese, the war year.
Yeah.
And that's what I know.
Well, I know the sympathizers translated, but I didn't know they were allowed to be published. The last time I heard it was still waiting to be distributed, so I could be wrong.
Great, thank you. Are there any more questions?
Well, I just like to say, one of my friends is in Houston. He's a combat fighter pilot for Vietnam during the war from 1963 to 1975 in the cockpit. And, a lot of his Vietnam colleagues from the South Vietnamese Air Force went to Vietnam like 4 years ago, and he said, "Oh, we had so much fun."
Yeah.
They went back and had a blast. There was no, "Oh, you're the bad guy." No, they had so much fun over
There's
there.
over 100 million people,
Yeah.
and the bulk of the
Yeah.
population were born after the
Yeah.
war, so they
Yeah.
have no living memory of that war.
Yeah.
Some 10 years ago, I helped Vietnamese American journalists to interview folks in Vietnam because they fly in every 10 years, on
Yeah.
anniversary,
Yeah.
April 30th. And they asked the question of young people, say, what do you think of the war? And usually the answer is, which one? Because for them, it's all history. And
Yeah.
so Vietnam has had like 4 or 5 in the last 100 years. Whereas the American, we're in South Center about the only war, we tend to think that this is the only war that matters.
Right.
But it's not true because the Vietnamese, they occupied Cambodia for another 10 years.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people who step on mines. In fact, I remember one time this LA Times reporter immediately made this comment when she saw a man in army uniform with one leg, and she said, "Look, he stepped on American mines." And I say, "How do you know?" So we went and interviewed the guy. I say, "No, I stepped on a Khmer Rouge mine because I was in Cambodia, occupying that country." Again, it's our assumption that the mea culpa as a way of writing about Vietnam that make us so, I don't know, missing the whole story.
China is today, Vietnam today is a very successful country. Like Da Nang is a technical hub for, silicon industries and things like that. China's looking at that real estate, and I think it was a General Jep, he condemned China. Don't you even think on ever taking our country. You're after our aluminum, you're after our oil deposits, Vietnam must be very careful how friendly they are with the United States, because China will just come right in and just take over, because a lot of people in Vietnam, they're not in tune with what's going on. It's
Well, I think Vietnam is constantly fighting this sort of between these two superpowers. And, and it's a negotiation that hasn't ended since 1950 something.
Yeah. So we wish Vietnam the best of luck. Wish them the best. Yeah.
Are there any more questions? Yes.
If you would please go to the microphone and ask the questions. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that.
First of all, thank you both for being here and sharing your stories, the story of your father and uncle. So I was wondering if you've ever met or spoken to Eddie Adams and what you thought about what he said about feeling a lot of guilt about essentially he thought he ruined your uncle's life. Thank you.
Funny you should ask. No, if I met him, I would have been so little that I wouldn't even know what to have said to him. But the American photographer was a constant presence in my childhood. My uncle, of course, my mom, and that guy. The American photographer. So, although I've never met Eddie, I feel like him and my uncle are twins in my mind, caught in this relationship that revolves around something, that I don't understand, but it's there. And it's just always been whispering in the back of my mind. So I've never met him, but I've always, in the more recently, thought of him more often. flyers kind of going around, and the movie is about Eddie Adams and his remorse, and where that led him afterwards, you know, and how Eddie Adams actually ultimately, so in the front here, yes, take that. In the front here are free stories, I have some free stories and stickers. I'm usually at literary events, so my stuff looks a little corny, but it's up here if you want it, and then Andrew has his books, and we're here to Andrew to sell and sign books, but, so, I think Eddie's remorse, actually led him to try to build a really much stronger relationship with my uncle, get to know him better. I've watched countless videos, interviews with Eddie, in which, so after silent execution, Eddie followed my uncle to Hawaii and wanted to do like because when Eddie took that picture, the AP was like, we want to know more, who's this guy? Get the story behind him, and so Eddie went to, he just kind of kept wanting to see my uncle, and my uncle was putting him off until the very end. And so ultimately, he and my uncle formed, I guess, a strong acquaintance. I don't know if my uncle would consider him a friend. I don't know. I'd have to ask my cousin to see if that would be the case. But I know that Eddie respected him a great deal. And for whatever reason, in my mind, I just have an affinity towards Eddie Adams. You know, maybe because he testified on behalf of my uncle in front of Congress, but also you get the sense when you listen to interviews of Eddie that it didn't ruin just my uncle, it was him, Eddie's life as well. You know, it affected him as well. So.
You know, there is a strangeness to this story, I think, where the Vietnam story and the American story begins, is that the man who was executed had killed an entire family before that, and that family was, I think, the subordinate, the man was subordinate to, General Lam. But one of the kids survived because the maid pushed him over the fence before this man massacred the family. And that kid is now the first Vietnamese American general in America.
He's an admiral. He was here last year.
So it's really extraordinary story that, you know, it shoots in very different direction, you know what I mean?
Yeah, actually, Najla Lockwood has put together a short, I believe it's only 20 minutes, where she has, I haven't watched it yet, I'm gonna go see it with my cousin in May, but I believe that it kind of captures the story of these three entities, the children of them. So, my cousin, of course, and then the Admiral, and then possibly some more, so I don't know, I haven't seen it yet, but to your question, I do think that Eddie's life was, changed forever, and then everything he did afterwards seemed to kind of fall back on this redemption story, which I try to capture in my movie. You're almost done? And
one more question. I have one question each for each of you. First, I want to express my gratitude to Andrew for sharing your very heartfelt feelings and recollections to your father. And my question is that it seems that at the beginning, during your enfant terrible phase, your father was a source of resentment. And I want to know how eventually that source of resentment turns into a source of inspiration for you and your work. And the second question to Zora is that you made reference, I cited Andrew actually, so both of you can answer this question, that the footage of the Saigon execution filmed by NBC, I believe, was doctored or spliced in some way. So in what particular way and how do we find out about that, the way it was doctored? Thank you.
I can answer that, but it's really Anthony Lamb's father who wrote about it. So there's another book that's quite rare called Autopsy that Andrew was just telling me about. So it's in Autopsy, so that's why all the evidence, I don't have it from one NBC obviously, but the way it was altered was that, and I hesitate to talk about this because I really don't want to focus on this, but when the Captain Lam, I believe his name was, fell, between the time in which he fell and the blood flowed out of his brain, was not sufficiently fast enough for NBC. And so they spliced it so that it was almost like instantaneous that he fell and then all his blood, and then that is then, shown over and over again, and I remember just over and over again. They don't show it anymore, but as a child, I watched it literally every single year from the time I was landed in here to 1975, all the way till must have been 1990s, and then they stopped doing that. So it's in the autopsy, and maybe it's in this one, because you said this is the part that we call it. So it's in
Yeah. I'll just, how did I walk out on this shower? I just, I watched my brother. My older brother had worshipped him, had adored him and worshipped him, and it had eaten him alive. I mean, when you have a larger than life father, and you try to copy him, you inevitably fail. Because my brother got a black belt, but only 1 degree. My father, promised all these great things. If, he sent my brother to the U.S. to study, and when the war ended, we joined him instead of him graduating and come back to us. And so my brother carried this bitterness because he had this vision of like trying to be like my father, and that didn't happen. And that's one of the skirmishes in the family that I watched growing up. So one way for me not to deal with all that is that I try not to let my father's vision of what I should be dictate what I do, and when I told him I was going to be a writer, he was very surprised, but when I did make it as a writer and started winning awards, he actually stood up at family dinner and say, "I'm proud of you," in English, which is something neither my brother and I ever expected from my father, And I always felt that he said it to the wrong son, because my brother tried so hard to please my dad, and I tried to walk away from all that and just be myself, and ended up finding my own vocation, my own path in life. And my father turned out to admire it. So we kind of become friends in a way, which is kind of odd to say.
Yeah, that's a happy story,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. So why don't you meet Andrew up here if you want to purchase some of his books?